The crackle of gunfire echoed through the valley as Katherine Norris crouched behind the overturned wagon, her hands trembling with fear and guilt. Blood stained her once pristine blue dress, though none of it was her own. The year was 1876, and in the unforgiving landscape of the Dakota Territory, her world had just collapsed around her. "They're coming back," shouted a gruff voice from nearby. "We can't hold them off much longer." Catherine's eyes darted to the horizon where a cloud of dust signaled the approaching riders. The bank robbery hadn't gone according to plan. It was never supposed to end in bloodshed. But her brother Thomas had panicked, and now the sheriff of Blackwater Creek lay dead, along with 2 deputies. "I never wanted this," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face. A shadow fell over her, and Katherine looked up to find herself staring into the steely blue eyes of a stranger. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his clothes dusty from the trail, but there was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I'd suggest you find better company than these outlaws. They won't last the hour." "I can't leave," she replied, her voice breaking. Your brother just rode off with the rest of that gang," the man stated flatly, nodding toward the east. "Left you behind as a distraction." Katherine felt her heart sink. Thomas had promised he'd come back for her. They were supposed to escape together, start new lives in California with the money from the bank. "Who are you?" she asked, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. "Lucas Quinn," he replied, extending a calloused hand. "Most folks just call me Luke." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Luke glanced over his shoulder before turning back to Katherine. "Those men coming will hang you alongside what's left of your brother's gang. If you want to live to see tomorrow, you need to come with me now." Katherine hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. "Katherine Norris," she said as he pulled her to her feet, "though I doubt I'll be welcome to that name anymore." Luke led her to where his horse waited, a magnificent chestnut stallion that pawed impatiently at the ground. "Can you ride?" he asked, already helping her onto the saddle. "Since I was 5, she replied, gathering the reins as Luke swung up behind her. As they galloped away from the scene of carnage, Katherine felt tears streaming down her face. Everything she had ever known, her home, her family name, her future, was now behind her, tainted by blood and betrayal. "They'll never forgive me," she said, her words nearly lost in the wind. The cowboy's voice came close to her ear, steady and sure. "Then I'll forgive you enough for all." Katherine didn't know why this stranger would offer such absolution, but as they rode deeper into the wilderness with a posse surely forming behind them, she clung to those words like a drowning woman to driftwood. 3 days later, they were still riding. Luke had taken them on a winding path through canyons and forests, crossing rivers at unexpected points and doubling back on their trail multiple times. Katherine had quickly learned that Lucas Quinn was no ordinary cowboy. He moved through the wilderness with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years avoiding being found. They made camp in a small clearing, sheltered by a rocky outcropping that would hide their fire from distant eyes. Katherine sat on a fallen log, watching as Luke prepared a modest meal of beans and jerky. Her body ached from days in the saddle, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight of guilt that pressed upon her. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked as he handed her a tin plate of food. Luke settled across from her, the firelight dancing across his features. "I recognize trouble when I see it," he said simply, "and I know what it's like to be judged for something you never intended to happen." Katherine studied him. In the flickering light, she could see a long scar that ran along his jawline, partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble. "You're running from something too," she observed. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Aren't we all in one way or another?" They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. "My brother Thomas convinced me to help him," Katherine said suddenly, setting down her plate. "Said it would just be a simple job, distract the bank manager while he and his friends emptied the safe. No one was supposed to get hurt." She closed her eyes, remembering the moment everything went wrong, but the sheriff walked in. Thomas panicked. Luke nodded, his expression grave. "First time I killed a man, it was an accident too," he said quietly. I was 18, working cattle, drives up from Texas, got into a fight in a saloon, pushed a man. He fell wrong, hit his head on the corner of a table. His eyes met hers across the fire. His family never forgave me. Called it murder, though the judge ruled it self-defense. Katherine felt a connection forming between them, a thin thread of understanding in a world that had always seemed eager to condemn. "What will happen now?" she asked. "We keep moving," Luke replied, stoking the fire. "I know a place up in the Montana Territory. Small ranch, belongs to an old friend who owes me a favor. We can lay low there until things cool down." "And then what?" Luke shrugged. "Then you decide what kind of life you want to build from the ashes of the old one." That night, as Katherine lay wrapped in a borrowed blanket beneath the vast canopy of stars, she realized that for the first time in years, she was making her own choice. It wasn't a good choice, perhaps running from justice with a stranger, but it was hers alone, not influenced by Thomas or anyone else. As dawn broke the next morning, Luke was already awake, saddling the horse and scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. "Trouble?" Katherine asked, quickly rolling up her blanket. "Just being cautious," he replied. "We're entering Blackfoot territory today. They're generally peaceful with whites these days, but it's best we avoid any unnecessary encounters." They rode in companionable silence for most of the morning, the landscape gradually changing from dense forest to rolling hills. Katherine found herself studying Luke's profile when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. Around midday, they stopped by a small stream to rest the horse and refresh themselves. Katherine knelt by the water, splashing her face and neck, grateful for the momentary relief from the dust of the trail. "You know," Luke said, settling beside her, "you never told me why you agreed to help your brother. You don't strike me as the outlaw type." Katherine sighed, watching the clear water flow over the smooth stones. "My father died last winter, left us with nothing but debts. The bank was going to take our home." She plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between her fingers. "Thomas said this was our only chance. One quick job and we'd have enough to pay off what we owed and start fresh somewhere else. Family has a way of making us do things we'd never otherwise consider," Luke observed. "What about your family?" Katherine asked. A shadow crossed Luke's face. "Lost my parents to cholera when I was 14. Been on my own ever since." Before Katherine could respond, Luke suddenly tensed, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Following his gaze, she spotted several riders on the distant ridge, silhouetted against the sky. "Don't move," he whispered, slowly standing. "Those aren't Blackfoot. The way they're riding those are white men." Katherine felt her heart racing. "The posse, maybe, or bounty hunters." He quickly gathered their belongings. "Either way, we need to move, now." They mounted in haste, Luke leading them into a densely wooded area where the undergrowth would help conceal their trail. As they pushed deeper into the forest, Katherine found herself clinging to Luke's waist, her face pressed against his back as branches whipped past them. When they finally stopped hours later, the sun was beginning to set. Luke helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "We should be safe here for the night," he said, his voice low. Katherine looked around at the small clearing, surrounded by dense pines that would shield any firelight from distant eyes. "How did you know where to find this place?" Luke's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "I've spent a lot of time in these parts." As he busied himself with setting up their camp, Katherine couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious past that had taught Lucas Quinn to live so cautiously. Whatever had happened to him, it had shaped him into a man who understood how to disappear, a skill that might be the only thing keeping her from the gallows now. That night, huddled close for warmth without a fire to risk giving away their position, Katherine found herself drawn to the quiet strength of the cowboy who had, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, chosen to risk everything to help her. "Luke," she whispered into the darkness. "Hum." He murmured, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "Thank you for everything." His hand found hers in the darkness, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Get some rest, Katherine. Tomorrow will be another long day." As the days turned into weeks, their journey north continued. They skirted small towns and settlements. Luke venturing in alone occasionally to purchase supplies while Katherine remained hidden. During those long hours of solitude, she would practice the new identity Luke had crafted for her. Katherine became Kate Williams, a young widow traveling with her brother-in-law to start a new life after tragedy. It was during one such wait, hidden in a copse of trees outside a mining settlement called Silver Creek, that Katherine's life changed again. She had been dozing against the trunk of a pine tree when the sound of approaching hooves startled her awake. Her first thought was that Luke had returned, but the rhythm was wrong. Multiple horses, moving quickly. Heart pounding, she crouched lower, peering through the underbrush. 4 men rode into view, their expressions grim and purposeful. Each wore a star-shaped badge. "Tracks lead this way," one of them called out. "Can't be more than a day old." Katherine held her breath, pressing herself against the earth as they passed within yards of her hiding place. They were heading toward town, toward Luke. Once they disappeared from view, she moved quickly, gathering their belongings and preparing the horse. She couldn't ride into town after Luke, that would be suicide, but she couldn't leave him to face capture alone either. After what seemed like an eternity, Katherine heard someone approaching through the trees. She raised the revolver Luke had taught her to use, her hands shaking slightly. "It's me," Luke's voice called softly before he appeared, moving quickly with a bundle of supplies. "Lawmen," she said urgently. "4 of them headed into town. They were following our trail." Luke's expression hardened. "I saw them. We need to move now." They rode hard through the night, pushing the horse to its limits as they climbed higher into the mountains. By dawn, they had crossed into territory so rugged that even experienced trackers would struggle to follow. Exhausted, they finally stopped in a small canyon where a clear spring bubbled from the rocks. As Luke tended to their exhausted mount, Katherine unrolled the bundle of supplies he'd purchased. "What's this?" she asked, holding up a plain calico dress and woman's coat. "Thought you might be tired of wearing the same clothes for weeks," Luke replied, not meeting her eyes. "And it'll help with your new identity." Katherine ran her fingers over the simple fabric, nothing like the fine dresses she'd once worn, but clean and practical. "Thank you," she said softly. While Luke scouted the area, she used some of their precious water to wash as best she could before changing into the new dress. When he returned, his step faltered momentarily at the sight of her. "What?" she asked self-consciously, smoothing down the fabric. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just, you look nice, is all." That evening, as they sat beside a small fire, Luke pulled out a folded newspaper from his saddlebag. "You should see this," he said, handing it to Katherine. The headline made her blood run cold. "Norris Gang Captured 3 Hanged for Murder of Sheriff." With trembling hands, she read the account of how her brother Thomas and 2 of his accomplices had been caught trying to cross into Canada. They had been tried, convicted, and executed within a week. "There's more," Luke said gently. "Keep reading." Her eyes skipped down the page. "Female accomplice Katherine Norris remains at large, believed to have perished in the wilderness." "They think I'm dead," she whispered, looking up at Luke in disbelief. He nodded. "The article mentions a woman's belongings found near a river crossing. Apparently there was evidence of a struggle, possibly an attack by wild animals." "But I never," she stopped, realization dawning. "You planted those things." Luke's gaze was steady. "During one of our supply runs, left some torn clothing, some blood from a deer I'd hunted." "Enough to make them think you'd met a bad end." Katherine stared at him, struggling to process what this meant. "Why would you do that?" "Because Katherine Norris needed to die," he said simply. "So that you could live." Tears welled in her eyes. "My brother is dead." Luke moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Katherine." She leaned into his embrace, grief and relief washing over her in equal measure. Thomas had made his choices, had abandoned her when things went wrong. Yet he was still her brother, the last of her family, and now he was gone. "It's just me now," she whispered. Luke's arm tightened around her. "You're not alone." The next morning, something had shifted between them. As they continued their journey, there was a new awareness, a tension that hummed in the air whenever their eyes met or their hands accidentally touched. 3 days later, they crossed into the Montana Territory. The landscape opened up before them, vast prairies stretching toward distant mountains, the air crisp and clean. For the first time since their flight began, Katherine felt something like hope stirring in her chest. "How much farther to your friend's ranch?" she asked as they crested a ridge overlooking a wide valley. "2 days, maybe less if the weather holds," Luke replied. "See those mountains to the north? His place is nestled in a valley just beyond them." That night they made camp near a small pond surrounded by cottonwood trees. The evening was unseasonably warm, and after weeks on the trail, the still water looked incredibly inviting. "I'm going to wash properly," Katherine announced, gathering her spare clothes. "And don't you dare peek, Lucas Quinn." A hint of color touched his cheeks as he nodded, turning to busy himself with setting up camp. "I'll see about catching us some fish for dinner." Katherine waited until he had disappeared among the trees before stripping off her dusty clothes and wading into the cool water. The sensation was heavenly after so many days of trail dust and hasty washes from a canteen. She ducked beneath the surface, feeling the water sluice through her hair and over her skin. When she emerged, she caught a glimpse of Luke standing at the edge of the trees, quickly turning away when he realized she had seen him. Rather than feeling angry, Katherine felt a flutter of something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with embarrassment. Later, as they sat beside the fire eating the trout Luke had caught and cooked, Katherine found herself studying him openly. In the firelight, his features were softened, the hard lines of his face relaxed as he told her stories of his years on the trail. "How did you learn to live this way?" she asked during a lull in the conversation. "Always moving, always watching over your shoulder." Luke was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "After that man died in the saloon, his brothers swore they'd see me hang for it. Judge ruled it self-defense, but they didn't care." He tossed the stick into the flames. "They were powerful men in those parts. Started a manhunt, put a bounty on my head. I learned to stay ahead of them, to read signs, to become someone else when needed." "Are they still looking for you?" "2 are dead now, one from consumption, one from a mining accident. The third still puts out wanted posters every few years, though most lawmen know the truth of what happened." He looked up at her. "That's why I understood your situation, Katherine. I know what it's like to have your life defined by a single terrible moment." Without thinking, Katherine moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "My name is Kate now," she said softly. "Katherine died by that river, remember?" Luke's fingers tightened around hers. "Kate," he said, testing the name on his tongue. His eyes, reflecting the dancing flames, met hers. "It suits you." The tension between them crackled like the fire, and for a breathless moment, Katherine thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers lingering against her cheek. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Still have a long ride ahead of us." That night, as Katherine lay wrapped in her blanket, she found herself unable to sleep, her thoughts consumed by the cowboy lying just a few feet away. In the weeks they had traveled together, he had become more than just her rescuer. He had become her confidant, her teacher, and perhaps something more. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. In the midst of running for her life, she had somehow found someone who saw beyond her mistakes, who offered not just protection but understanding. It seemed impossible, yet as she finally drifted into sleep, Katherine admitted to herself that she was falling in love with Lucas Quinn. The next morning dawned clear and bright. They packed up camp efficiently, the routine now familiar after weeks on the trail together. As Luke helped Katherine onto their horse, his hands at her waist, she felt that same flutter in her chest when their eyes met briefly. They had been riding for several hours when Luke suddenly reined in the horse, his posture alert. "What is it?" Katherine asked, immediately concerned. "Smoke," he said, pointing toward a thin, dark column rising in the distance. "That's about where my friend's ranch should be." They rode hard toward the smoke, cresting a hill to find a devastating sight below them. What must have once been a modest ranch house was now smoldering ruins. Nearby outbuildings had been burned as well, and fence posts had been knocked down in several places. "No," Luke breathed, spurring the horse down the slope. As they approached, Katherine could see the signs of violence everywhere, broken furniture scattered across the yard. a wagon overturned, and most disturbingly, a large, dark stain on the ground near what remained of the house. Luke dismounted quickly, helping Katherine down before approaching the ruins with his revolver drawn. He moved cautiously, scanning for any sign of threat or survivors. "Hello," he called out. "Frank, anyone here?" A weak voice answered from the direction of a small root cellar, whose doors had been partially concealed by fallen debris. "Who's there?" Luke rushed to clear the debris, pulling open the cellar doors to reveal an older man with a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his leg. His face was pale from blood loss, his clothes dirty and torn. "Luke," the man asked incredulously. "Is that really you?" "It's me, Frank," Luke confirmed, holstering his weapon and helping the man out of his hiding place. "What happened here?" As Katherine brought water from the well that had miraculously remained untouched, Frank told his story. Raiders had attacked the ranch 3 days earlier, not Indians, but white men claiming to be collecting a debt. "They were looking for you, Luke," Frank said grimly. "Said you owed them for what you did to their brother." Luke's face darkened. "The Wilcox brothers. Only one left now, Ezra, but he's got a gang riding with him. They killed my ranch hand when he tried to stand up to them." Frank took a shaky breath. "Said they'd be back, that they knew you were heading this way." Katherine felt a chill run down her spine. "How could they know that? Been asking about you in every town from Wyoming to here," Frank explained. "Must have picked up your trail somewhere." Luke's expression was grim as he rebandaged Frank's wounded leg. "This is my fault, Frank. I never should have led them here." "Don't talk nonsense," the older man replied gruffly. "You couldn't have known." As dusk approached, they moved Frank to the relative shelter of the barn, which had sustained less damage than the house. Luke insisted on taking first watch, positioning himself where he could see any approach to the ranch. Katherine joined him after making sure Frank was comfortable, sitting beside him on an overturned barrel. "This is because of me, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "If you hadn't stopped to help me, you wouldn't have been tracked here." Luke shook his head. "Ezra Wilcox has been hunting me for years. This was just bad timing." He looked at her, his expression serious. "But you should know what you're caught up in now. These men won't stop. They don't care about justice, only revenge." "I'm not afraid," Katherine said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I've been running from something since the day we met. At least now I know what I'm facing." Luke's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You're a remarkable woman, Kate." The way he said her new name sent a warmth spreading through her, despite the danger they faced. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of their shared predicament hanging between them. "What will we do now?" Katherine finally asked, Luke's jaw set in determination. "First, we get Frank to safety. There's a settlement about 10 miles east of here. He'll be able to get proper medical attention there. After that," he hesitated. "After that, we face them," Katherine finished for him. "Together." Luke looked at her with surprise, then something that might have been admiration. "It's not your fight. It became my fight the moment you risked everything to help me," she replied firmly. "You gave me a second chance at life, Luke. Let me help you fight for yours." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching hooves shattered the quiet night. Luke immediately pulled Katherine down into the shadows of the barn. "Get Frank," he whispered urgently. "There's a trapdoor in the stall at the back, leads to a root cellar. Hide there and don't make a sound." "What about you?" she asked, clutching his arm. "I'll lead them away from here," he said, checking his revolver. "Buy you time to get Frank to safety." Katherine wanted to protest, but the determined look in Luke's eyes told her it would be futile. Instead, she did something that surprised them both. She pulled him close and pressed her lips to his in a desperate kiss. When they parted, Luke looked slightly dazed. "What was that for?" "For luck," she whispered. "And because I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you before I had the chance." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'll come back for you, I promise." With that, he slipped out of the barn and into the darkness. Katherine hurried to where Frank was resting, quickly explaining the situation as she helped him to his feet. "That fool boy," Frank muttered as they made their way to the hidden trapdoor, "always trying to be the hero." From their hiding place below the barn floor, Katherine and Frank listened to the chaos that erupted above. Shouts, then gunfire, a lot of it. The sound of horses galloping, more shots, and then, gradually, silence. They remained hidden until dawn, neither daring to speak, both fearing the worst. When Katherine finally ventured to lift the trapdoor and peek out, the barn was empty, showing signs of a violent struggle. Outside, two unfamiliar men lay dead in the yard, but there was no sign of Luke. "He led them away," Frank said, leaning heavily on Katherine as they emerged from hiding. That was always his way: face trouble head-on, but on his terms. "We need to find him," Katherine said, her voice tight with worry. Frank pointed toward a saddled horse that had wandered back to the corral. "Take my mare. I can manage here until you return." "I can't leave you. You can and you will," Frank interrupted firmly. "That boy saved my life more than once. I won't be responsible for him losing his because you stayed to nurse an old man." Katherine hesitated only briefly before gathering what supplies she could find. As she mounted the horse, Frank handed her a rifle. "Follow the creek bed heading north," he instructed. "Luke knows these mountains. If he's alive, that's where he'll go." The urgency in Frank's voice told Katherine everything she needed to know Luke's chances weren't good against multiple pursuers. With a nod of determination, she spurred the horse northward, following the winding creek that led into increasingly rugged terrain. The trail wasn't difficult to follow. Signs of a desperate chase marked the path. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and eventually, worryingly, blood spattered on rocks and leaves. Katherine pushed on, her heart in her throat, scanning constantly for any sign of Luke or his pursuers. By midday, she had climbed high into the foothills, the creek having narrowed to little more than a trickle. The signs of passage were becoming harder to discern, but Katherine pressed forward, trusting her instincts and the tracking skills Luke had begun to teach her during their weeks together. It was late afternoon when she heard a single gunshot echoing through the mountains. Katherine urged her tired mount toward the sound, cresting a ridge to see a narrow ravine below. There, trapped against a sheer cliff face, was Luke, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood staining his shirt. Facing him were three men, their weapons trained on him. Katherine dismounted quickly, tying the horse to a tree before crawling to the edge of the ridge. She was too far away to hear what was being said, but the scene was clear enough. Luke was cornered, injured, and outnumbered. Without hesitation, Katherine raised the rifle Frank had given her. Luke had taught her to shoot during their journey, but they had focused on handguns, not rifles. Still, the principle was the same: steady breathing, clear sight, gentle squeeze. Her first shot went wide, sending the men below diving for cover. Her second found its mark, striking one of them in the shoulder. The distraction was enough for Luke to raise his revolver with his good arm, firing twice in quick succession. One of the men fell. Another returned fire, sending Luke diving behind a boulder. The third man, clearly wounded, was retreating toward the horses. Katherine fired again, her bullet kicking up dirt near the feet of the man shooting at Luke. He turned, scanning the ridge, finally spotting her. As he swung his rifle in her direction, Luke emerged from cover and fired, the shot catching the man squarely in the chest. For a moment, everything was still. Then Katherine saw Luke slump against the boulder, his revolver falling from his grasp. Heart racing, she scrambled back to her horse and rode down into the ravine as fast as the treacherous path would allow. By the time she reached Luke, he was pale and sweating, his breathing labored. The left side of his shirt was soaked with blood from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his shoulder. "You came," he said weakly as she knelt beside him. "Of course I came," she replied, quickly tearing strips from her petticoat to bandage his wound. "I made a promise too, remember?" Luke winced as she pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound. "Ezra?" he asked. Katherine glanced at the bodies nearby. "3 men, is one of them Ezra Wilcox?" Luke shook his head slightly. "Didn't see him among them. Must have sent his men while he waited somewhere safer." This news was troubling. Their most dangerous enemy was still out there, but Katherine pushed the thought aside to focus on Luke's immediate needs. "We need to get you back to Frank's," she said, helping him to his feet. "Can you ride?" Luke nodded grimly. "Not the first time I've been shot." Somehow, they managed to get him onto her horse. Katherine rode behind him, one arm wrapped around his waist to keep him steady as they slowly made their way back down the mountain. By the time they reached Frank's ranch, night had fallen, and Luke was barely conscious. Frank had managed to clear some space in what remained of the house, creating a makeshift shelter. Together, he and Katherine got Luke inside and onto a bed. Bullet went clean through, Frank observed as they examined the wound. That's something, at least. For the next 2 days, Katherine barely left Luke's side, changing his bandages, coaxing him to drink water and broth, and watching anxiously for signs of fever. When infections set in despite their best efforts, she fought it with every remedy Frank knew, bathing Luke's burning skin with cool water and forcing willow bark tea between his parched lips. On the 3rd night, as a storm raged outside the damaged house, Luke's fever finally broke. Katherine, exhausted from her vigil, had fallen asleep in a chair beside his bed. She woke to find him watching her, his blue eyes clear for the first time in days. "You saved my life," he said softly. Katherine reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You saved mine first." A half-smile touched his lips. "Guess that makes us even?" "Not even close," she replied. "You gave me a new life, a new identity. You forgave me when no one else would." Luke's expression grew serious. "Kate," he said, using her new name deliberately, "there's something I need to tell you." Before he could continue, Frank appeared in the doorway. "Ryder's coming," he announced grimly. "Looks like Ezra finally showed up." Luke immediately tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "Get me my gun." "You can barely stand," Katherine protested. "Doesn't matter," Luke replied, his jaw set. "This ends today one way or another." Frank handed Luke his revolver, then positioned himself at one of the windows with his shotgun. Katherine, after a moment's hesitation, picked up the rifle she had used in the mountains. "Stay back," Luke instructed her as he staggered to his feet. "This is between Ezra and me." "I told you before," Katherine said firmly, checking the rifle's loading. "Your fight is my fight now." Before Luke could argue further, a voice called from outside. "Quinn, I know you're in there. Send out the woman and the old man, and maybe I'll let you die quick." Luke moved to the door, supporting himself against the frame. "It's just me you want, Ezra. The others have nothing to do with this." "They chose their side when they helped you," the voice responded. "But I'm feeling generous today. Send out the woman as a show of good faith and we can talk terms." Katherine stepped up beside Luke, her rifle ready. "Not happening," she called out. Luke glanced at her with a mixture of pride and exasperation. "You're not making this easier," he murmured. "I'm not trying to," she replied. Outside, they could see Ezra Wilcox, a large man with a graying beard, and 4 others, all armed and spreading out to surround the house. "Last chance, Quinn," Ezra shouted, "or we burn what's left of this place to the ground with you in it." Luke turned to Katherine, his expression resolute. "When I step outside, get to the back of the house. There's a chance you and Frank can slip away while Ezra is focused on me." "I'm not leaving you," Katherine insisted. "This isn't up for debate," Luke said firmly. "I started this years ago and I need to finish it." Before Katherine could protest further, a gunshot rang out, but not from Ezra or his men. From somewhere beyond the ranch, a rifle barked, and one of Ezra's men fell. Another shot followed quickly, dropping a second man. Confused, Ezra and his remaining men turned toward this new threat, providing the distraction Luke needed. He stepped outside, revolver raised despite his weakened condition. "It's over, Ezra," he called out. "Drop your weapon." Ezra Wilcox spun back toward Luke, his face contorted with rage. "Never," he snarled, raising his gun. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, Luke's and Katherine's, who had stepped up beside him despite his orders. Ezra staggered, looking down at the blood spreading across his chest with an expression of disbelief before collapsing to the ground. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall and still under fire from the unknown rifleman in the distance, quickly surrendered, throwing down their weapons. As Luke kept his revolver trained on them, riders appeared from the direction of the mysterious gunfire, 3 men wearing badges. U.S. Marshals, the lead rider announced as they approached. "Looks like we arrived just in time." The next hour passed in a blur of explanations. The marshals had been tracking Ezra Wilcox and his gang for months, following a string of robberies and murders across 3 territories. They had learned of the attack on Frank's ranch and had been closing in when they spotted Katherine riding into the mountains after Luke. "We've been aware of your situation for some time, Mr. Quinn." the lead marshal explained as they sat in what remained of Frank's house. The original case against you was reviewed by a federal judge last year. Your slate's been wiped clean. Luke stared at the man in disbelief. What are you saying? I'm saying there's no bounty on your head anymore. The Wilcox brothers were operating outside the law, pursuing a personal vendetta. As this news sank in, the marshal turned his attention to Katherine. Now, as for you, madam, Katherine felt her heart sink. This was at the moment her past would catch up to her. Marshal, Luke began, but Katherine placed a hand on his arm. My name is Katherine Norris, she said steadily. I was involved in a bank robbery in Dakota Territory that resulted in the death of a sheriff and 2 deputies. The marshal studied her for a long moment. Katherine Norris is dead, according to all official reports, killed by wild animals while fleeing justice. He glanced at Luke. Convenient that. Luke met his gaze unflinchingly. The marshal continued, the men responsible for those deaths have paid the price. Justice has been served. He stood, adjusting his hat. As far as I'm concerned, my business here is with Ezra Wilcox and his gang, not with ghosts. After the marshals had departed, taking their prisoners with them, a stunned silence fell over the damaged ranch house. Did that just happen? Katherine finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank chuckled, pouring himself a small measure of whiskey from a bottle that had miraculously survived the raid. Seems you two have been given something rare in this world, a clean slate. Luke turned to Katherine, his eyes filled with emotion despite his obvious exhaustion. What will you do now? He asked. You're free to go anywhere, be anyone. Katherine looked around at the damaged ranch, then back at Luke. This place needs rebuilding, she said simply. Seems like a good place to start a new life. It'll be a lot of work, Frank warned. I'm not afraid of work, Katherine replied, her eyes never leaving Luke's. And I'm not alone anymore. That night, as Frank snored softly in the corner, Katherine and Luke sat side by side on the porch steps, looking up at the star-filled sky. I never thought I'd see the day when I wasn't running from something, Luke said quietly. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of his wound. What will you do with all this freedom? Luke was silent for a long moment, his arm slipping around her waist. I was thinking of asking a certain stubborn woman if she might consider staying here, helping rebuild this place, maybe making it into something more than it was before. Katherine's heart skipped a beat. And what would this stubborn woman's role be in this rebuilt place? Luke turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. Whatever she wants it to be, partner, friend, he hesitated. Wife, if she'd have me. Wife, Katherine repeated, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. Lucas Quinn, are you proposing to me on the ruins of a porch? A slow smile spread across his face. I suppose I am. Not very romantic, is it? On the contrary, Katherine said, feeling tears of happiness threatening to spill. It's perfect. A new beginning built from the ashes of our old lives. Luke gently cupped her face in his hands. Katherine Norris may be dead, but Kate Quinn has her whole life ahead of her. If you want it, I do want it, she whispered. More than anything. As their lips met under the vast Montana sky, Katherine knew that the words Luke had spoken to her that first day, "Then I'll forgive you enough for all," had been more than just comfort. They had been a promise, one that he had kept through danger and hardship, leading them both to this moment of redemption. In the years that followed, the ranch flourished under their care. Frank, who had declared himself too ornery to die just yet, became like a father to them both, delighting in teaching their children, first a son, then twin daughters, the ways of ranch life. The incident at Blackwater Creek faded into history, becoming little more than a distant memory. Katherine Norris remained officially dead, while Kate Quinn became known throughout the valley as a woman of strength and compassion. On their 10th anniversary, Luke presented Katherine with a small wooden box. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, reporting the full pardon granted posthumously to Katherine Norris after evidence emerged that she had been coerced into participating in the robbery by her brother. How? Katherine asked, her fingers trembling as she read the article. Luke smiled. I may have written a few letters to some influential people over the years. Seemed right that your name should be cleared, even if you don't use it anymore. Katherine wrapped her arms around her husband, overwhelmed by the gift he had given her, not just a new life, but peace with her old one as well. "You know," she said later as they sat on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard, "I've been thinking about that day we met. About what you said to me." "Which part?" Luke asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "When I told you they'd never forgive me and you said you'd forgive me enough for all." She looked up at him. "Did you mean it then, or was it just something to say to a frightened woman?" Luke considered this, his eyes following their son as he attempted to lasso a fence post. "I think," he said slowly, "that I recognized something in you that day, someone who had made a mistake but wasn't defined by it, someone worth saving." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I didn't know I would fall in love with you then, but I think some part of me was already halfway there." Katherine smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Well, Cowboy," she said, using the nickname she reserved for private moments, "I'm glad you decided to forgive me, even if I didn't deserve it." "That's the thing about forgiveness, Kate," Luke replied, watching as their daughters joined their brother in his roping attempts, their laughter carrying across the yard. "It's never about what's deserved, it's about what's needed." As the sun set behind the mountains that had once sheltered them as fugitives, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate encounter beside an overturned wagon to this moment of peaceful contentment, their path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led them home. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the mistakes of their past, but the life they had built together, a life founded on second chances, hard work, and a love that had been strong enough to forgive even the unforgivable.